He bought the most dangerous horse at the auction, and that decision ended up saving his entire farm. Everyone at the auction warned him not to buy that horse. They said the gray giant was unpredictable, risky, a mistake that could ruin a man already hanging by a thread. But no one there knew what was coming the night the mountain collapsed, the night that dangerous horse would make a choice that changed everything. The wind that swept across the Montana plain didn't sound like wind anymore. It had the sharp, whistling edge of something alive, something hunting. It slipped through the cracks of the old Miller farmhouse and rattled the window panes like impatient fingers tapping on glass. Outside, the world was sealed under a harsh sheet of frozen white. Fields that once rolled golden in summer now stretched like a desert of snow, a quiet wasteland where nothing seemed willing to grow. Evan Miller stood on his porch, shoulders hunched inside a coat that had lost most of its insulation years ago. His breath came out in slow clouds, drifting upward before disappearing into the dull gray sky. He looked across the yard toward the empty corral, where a single, worn halter hung from a rail, one he had not been able to bring himself to put away. It still swung slightly when the wind pushed through, as if remembering the weight it used to hold. Rusty had been more than a horse. In the months after Evan's wife passed, her favorite mug still sitting untouched on the kitchen shelf, her handwriting in the recipe book soft and slanted. Rusty had become the only living creature he talked to without feeling foolish. The gelding had understood his hand on the reins, understood the silence he carried like a heavy stone. And 2 nights ago, on a patch of ice hidden beneath a fresh dusting of snow, Rusty slipped. The kind of slip that ends not in bruises, but in a stillness too deep to argue with. Evan had knelt beside him as the veterinarian whispered the words no farmer ever wants to hear. He's in pain. It's time. Now the corral was just quiet wood and empty space. Evan exhaled and stepped off the porch, his boots cracking through the crust of ice. The barn door groaned as he slid it open. Inside, the air was bitter and still. The tools hung neatly on hooks he had hammered in years ago when life still felt manageable. A few bales of hay leaned against the back wall, and in the center of the barn, the old cart Rusty used to pull sat waiting in the dim light. He ran his fingers along the wooden shaft. It was colder than metal. "You were supposed to help me through one more winter," he whispered, though the barn swallowed the words before they reached the air. Outside, the wind howled again. It sounded angry this time. The Miller farm had never been large, just enough acreage for a few dozen cattle, some crops when the weather allowed, and a man willing to work from dawn to dusk. But this winter had been different. Longer, colder, the kind of winter that took from you slowly, as if testing how much you were willing to lose before you broke. The cattle huddled in the shed, ribs showing through their winter coats. The bills on the kitchen table grew taller each week. And now, with Rusty gone, the last bit of help Evan could rely on had vanished. A man alone could not keep a farm breathing, not out here, not in this kind of cold. He walked back toward the house, boots sinking into the snow with each step. The sky had begun to dim, though it was barely past 4. That was winter's way, stealing light early and giving back only the darkness. Inside, he lit the kerosene lamp on the table. Its small flame flickered, painting the walls with warm, trembling shadows. He sat down in the old wooden chair across from the bills he hadn't opened yet. The envelopes were the same muted colors, brown, white, cream, the kind of colors that never carried good news. He slid them aside and stared at the radio on the counter instead. It crackled every few minutes, trying to catch a signal strong enough to break through the storm. Winter advisory. Dangerous conditions. Livestock losses reported. Local auction this weekend. The last line pulled him back to the table. The livestock auction. He didn't have much money left, barely enough to cover feed for another week. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He needed another horse. Not because he wanted to replace Rusty, nothing could, but because the farm couldn't survive without one. The cattle needed moving, the cart needed pulling, the fences needed mending. The land needed a partner, not a single, exhausted man trying to do the work of three. He rubbed his hands together, the cold from the barn still lingering in his palms. The auction was risky. He knew that. Horses sold cheap, there usually came with problems, temperament issues, injuries, bad histories. But what choice did he have? Hope wasn't something he could afford to wait for, not anymore. He stood and walked to the small bookshelf in the corner, pulling out a worn notebook with a faded blue cover. It was his wife's. She used to write shopping lists in it, little notes, reminders for him. He had repurposed it this past year, scribbling down farm expenses, dates, ideas that never quite worked out. On the next empty page, he wrote, "Billings auction, Saturday. Pray for something I can afford." The house fell back into silence after he closed the notebook. Only the wind answered. At the window, he watched snow drifting sideways across the yard, gathering in corners and creases, burying everything that stood still for too long. Somewhere beyond that frozen haze lay a chance. Small, desperate, but real. He pressed a hand against the cold glass. "I just need one more miracle," he murmured. Not loud, not expecting an answer. Just a man speaking to the night, because there was no one left to hear him. The wind carried his breath away. Behind him, the lamp flickered again, as though agreeing that miracles were rare in winters like this, but not impossible. Saturday morning arrived like a reluctant sigh. The sky over Billings was a pale wash of silver, the kind that made it hard to tell where the clouds ended and the cold began. Evan drove his aging pickup along the icy highway, the tires humming a steady, uneasy rhythm. The heater didn't work anymore, not really, so each breath inside the cab felt almost as cold as the air outside. His gloves were frayed at the fingertips, and the steering wheel was hard against his palms. But he kept driving, mile after mile, because turning around wasn't an option. This was the day he had to find a horse. Not a perfect one, just one that could help him keep the farm alive. When he reached the auction yard, the lot was already half full. Trucks from every corner of the region sat cockeyed in the snow, some idling, some abandoned, with their engines still ticking. The air smelled of hay and diesel, mixed with the sharper scent of animals shifting restlessly in their pens. Evan stepped out, boots crunching over the gravel. A banner flapped above the main gate, its edges torn from years of wind. Billings Livestock Auction. Every life has a price. Inside, the sound hit him first. Voices, shuffling hooves, auction calls bouncing like ricochets off the metal roof. Men in thick coats stood along the railings, sizing up each animal with trained, calculating eyes. They murmured about feed costs, breeding lines, winter losses, interest rates, inflation. Terms that felt more like financial storms than conversations. A few wore hats pulled low, others held coffee cups steaming in the cold air. No one looked particularly hopeful. Hard winters made realists out of everybody. Evan walked the aisles slowly, taking in the horses penned along the perimeter. There were quarter horses with sleek coats, their ears flicking nervously. A couple of Appaloosas tossed their heads, showing the whites of their eyes. A draft gelding stood in the corner, massive and patient, but the price posted on his gate was far beyond anything Evan could reach. Not even a loan, not even a miracle loan. He kept moving. A young mare pawed the ground, snorting at anyone who walked too close. "She'll buck a hole through your barn," one man muttered to another. A thin, sore-backed gelding shrank whenever someone raised a hand near him, flinching at shadows that weren't even there. A small crowd gathered around a glossy bay stallion, his muscles coiled like springs. Beautiful, yes, but Evan could already tell he carried more fire than Evan could ever hope to handle alone. He wasn't looking for power. He was looking for companionship, reliability, a partner. But those rarely came cheap, and rarely came without scars. An older rancher nodded to him as he passed. "Shopping on a day like this?" Evan offered a faint smile. "Trying to. Prices won't be kind. They never are." The man shrugged as if to say that was simply the world now, then moved on. Inside the auction ring, the first round had already started. The caller's voice rose and fell in sharp, rapid bursts, numbers, descriptions, quick-buck jokes to nudge the bidders. A thick-coated gelding sold quickly, followed by a mare with a sweet face and a sour temperament. Evan watched from the railing, clutching the envelope of money in his coat pocket. It wasn't much, just the remains of what little he'd saved over the years, plus the money from selling some old equipment that he'd hoped never to part with. As each horse paraded through the ring, the numbers climbed higher and higher, higher than what he could offer. The crowd thinned as the good prospects ran out, leaving behind the horses no one had rushed to buy. The auctioneer's voice softened into something closer to boredom. "Next up, lot number 42, draft gelding. Big fella? Bit of a handful, folks." The doors opened, and the horse entered the ring. And the noise, what little noise remained, dulled into a hush. He was enormous, standing taller than most draft breeds Evan had ever seen. His coat was a stormy gray, mixed with streaks of silver, like steel washed by moonlight. His mane hung in thick strands, uneven in places, as if someone had tried to trim it, but stopped halfway through. Faint scars curved along his shoulder and rib cage. Nothing fresh, but nothing forgotten either. And his eyes. His eyes were the color of deep water right before a storm, alert yet distant, carrying an old kind of sadness. A few men murmured, "That's the one they say kicked through a trailer door." "He's trouble. He'll drag a man across a field if you don't watch him." No one stepped closer. Atlas, Evan overheard someone call him that, stood in the center of the ring like he'd been through 1,000 such moments and survived them all. He didn't prance. He didn't shy. He just stood there, waiting for whatever came next, as if nothing surprised him anymore. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "We'll start at 500. Silence. 400? Still nothing. 350? A man in the back shook his head. Another crossed his arms. Someone snorted. Someone else muttered something about vet bills. Atlas flicked an ear, but didn't move. Evan felt something in his chest shift. Not hope, not yet, but recognition. Not of the horse, but of the feeling in the horse. That quiet readiness to be disappointed again. That stillness that wasn't calmness at all, but a kind of surrender that only comes when life has taught you not to expect much. 250, the auctioneer tried again. Even he sounded tired now. Evan swallowed hard. His envelope held barely more than that. And he knew what everyone else knew. Horses with scars came with stories that were rarely kind. Horses with reputations came with warnings. Horses like Atlas came with risk. But so did living. He stepped forward before he gave himself permission. His voice cracked once in the cold air. 250, he said. A few heads turned. The auctioneer blinked as if waking from a nap. 250, bid by the gentleman in the worn coat. Do I hear 275? Silence answered for the room. 250 going once, twice. Sold. The gavel struck. A dull, final sound that felt louder than thunder in Evan's ears. Atlas stood in the center of the ring, unmoving, as if the outcome made no difference to him one way or the other. And yet, when Evan stepped closer, something subtle shifted. The great gray horse tilted his head, barely, almost imperceptibly, and studied the man who had chosen him when no one else would. For the first time since Rusty's death, something warm flickered in Evan's chest. Not joy, not relief, just possibility. The kind a man feels when he realizes he is no longer entirely alone. The road home felt longer than it had that morning. The sky, once a pale silver, had deepened into a heavier gray, thick, unmoving, like a lid pressed down over the horizon. Evan drove almost silently, one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the envelope of paperwork he had signed barely an hour ago. In the rear-view mirror, the trailer rattled behind the truck, and inside it, Atlas stood with the immovable quiet of something ancient. The great horse didn't thrash or complain. He simply absorbed the road's tremors like an old tree taking the wind. Each mile carried its own kind of uncertainty. Evan had purchased risks before, old equipment, questionable cattle, but nothing that looked back at him with living eyes. He kept wondering if he had made a mistake he couldn't afford to correct. A risky horse wasn't like a broken tractor. A wrong decision now could mean more than debt. It could mean danger, injury, or worse. But each time doubt rose, he reminded himself of why he was doing this. A farm without a horse was a body without a heartbeat. Something had to pull the weight as Rusty once did. Something had to help him survive. By the time he reached the long dirt lane leading to the Miller farm, a thin curtain of snow had begun its slow descent. The flakes drifted in the headlights like faint sparks, softening the edges of the world. Evan backed the trailer up to the barn with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, though his hands trembled more than they should. When he opened the latch, Atlas didn't rush out. He didn't balk either. He simply stepped down the ramp with a slow, deliberate grace, each hoof landing like a careful decision. Inside the barn, the familiar scent of hay and old wood surrounded them. The rafters creaked faintly in the wind. Evan led Atlas to the larger stall Rusty used to call home. The halter rope felt strangely warm in his grip, as if the horse carried heat beneath all that quiet muscle. When he unhooked the rope, Atlas didn't move away. He simply stood there, broad chest rising and falling, eyes tracking the unfamiliar shape of the barn. "This, is it?" Evan murmured, though the words didn't feel like they needed an answer. "Home." Atlas flicked an ear, but otherwise remained still. Evan placed a bucket of fresh water inside the stall and filled the corner feeder with hay. Atlas lowered his head, sniffed, and began to eat with a slow, even rhythm. No rush, no anxiety, just a steady, deliberate acceptance. For a moment, watching the horse settle, Evan felt something like relief loosen around his ribs. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe the warnings had been exaggerated. That moment didn't last. When he reached to brush a bit of snow from Atlas's flank, the horse tensed instantly, every muscle gone rigid, ears flattening, head snapping up with a sharp warning lift. Not violent, not aggressive, just startled, deeply startled. The kind of startle that came from memory, not instinct. "Easy," Evan whispered, lowering his hand. Atlas didn't step back. He didn't bare his teeth or lunge. He simply froze, as though waiting for something he feared was coming. Something Evan couldn't see. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, his voice sounding smaller in the cavernous barn. Eventually, Atlas's muscles eased, only slightly, but enough. Evan stepped back, giving the horse room to breathe. The tension in the air thinned again, though it didn't disappear. Trust, he realized, wasn't going to come in one afternoon, maybe not even in one winter. He left the stall door open for a moment, just to watch. Atlas went back to eating, but he kept one eye fixed on Evan, cautious, uncertain, waiting for whatever the world had taught him to expect. "Two strangers under one roof," Evan murmured to himself. "Guess we'll figure it out together." The barn's overhead lights hummed as he tidied the feed room, but the silence between them remained gentle, not hostile, not warm, just a shared stillness between two battered souls learning the edges of each other's presence. Later, when the last of the chores were done, Evan paused before turning off the lights. He rested his hand lightly on the top rail of the stall and looked at the great gray figure inside. Atlas had finished eating and now stood facing the door, one ear tilted forward, the other relaxed sideways. Snow tapped softly on the barn roof. The air smelled of hay and winter. "You'll be all right here," Evan said, though he wasn't certain whether he was reassuring the horse or himself. Atlas blinked once, slow and heavy. It felt like an acknowledgement. When Evan stepped outside, the cold wrapped around him instantly, sharper than before. He closed the barn door gently, hearing the latch slide into place. Behind the wall of wood, the rhythmic sound of Atlas shifting his weight reached him, a reminder that he was no longer alone on this land. Not entirely. Inside his house, the warmth was thin, barely enough to soften the chill in his fingers. He made a simple dinner, ate without much thought, and finally settled into the old chair near the window. From there, he could just make out the barn through the drifting snow. A single bulb glowed inside, casting a weak halo across the yard. It was the kind of light that made a man feel less alone, even if the one sharing his land was a creature who didn't yet trust him. He leaned back, eyes heavy. The day had been long, hopeful in some ways, daunting in others. A farm was no place for illusions, and he knew tomorrow would bring its own challenges. A risky horse didn't stop being risky just because a man wanted to believe otherwise. But for tonight, just tonight, he allowed himself to feel something other than fear of the future. He closed his eyes to the soft, steady hum of wind brushing against the barn. Two strangers, one roof, one winter ahead. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin. The morning rose quietly over the Miller farm. The kind of morning that didn't rush into daylight, but crept forward, pale and hesitant. A thin mist clung to the ground, softening the outlines of the fence posts and turning the bare cottonwoods into faint silhouettes. Evan stepped out of the house with a bucket of feed in one hand, his breath hanging in the still air. His muscles ached from the previous day, part nerves, part exhaustion. But routine had a way of pulling a man forward, even when he wasn't sure of himself. The snow around the barn had hardened overnight, forming a brittle crust that cracked beneath his boots. As he pushed the barn doors open, the smell of hay and warm animal breath greeted him. Inside the stall, Atlas lifted his head slowly, eyes dark and unreadable. The big draft horse didn't move toward Evan, didn't shy away, just watched, as though measuring the distance between them in more ways than one. "Morning," Evan said softly. It wasn't a greeting he expected to be returned. Still, saying it out loud made the barn feel less empty. He reached for a bale of hay stacked against the wall. It had frozen slightly at the edges, making it heavier than he expected. He dragged it across the barn floor, boots slipping a little on the icy patches. Atlas watched every movement, his ears flicking, tracking each sound. When Evan reached the stall gate and bent to lift the bale over, his foot hit a slick spot, just half an inch of invisible ice hiding beneath the straw that had fallen from yesterday's feeding. The fall happened fast. His boot slid his body pitched forward. The bale knocked his shoulder off balance. For a split second, the world became a blur of cold air and the sharp smell of hay, and then he hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his chest. The bale toppled beside him, scattering bits of straw that drifted down like slow-motion confetti. Pain flared across his ribs. A choked sound escaped his throat, not loud enough to echo, but loud enough to cut through the stillness of the barn. Atlas reacted before Evan fully understood what had happened. The draft horse jerked his head up, muscles tightening beneath his winter coat. His hooves shifted, not in panic but in alertness, like a sentry hearing an unexpected noise. He stepped once, then again, closing the distance to the stall gate. His massive frame filled the opening as he leaned forward, nostrils flaring as he examined the man on the ground. Evan blinked through the haze of pain. "I'm fine," he murmured, though the words came out thin and breathless. Atlas didn't seem convinced. Slowly, almost cautiously, the horse lowered his head until his muzzle hovered inches above Evan's shoulder. Warm breath brushed against his cheek. Steady, rhythmic, grounding. Then, with surprising gentleness, Atlas touched the side of Evan's coat. Not a nudge, a touch. Soft as the wing beat of a bird, it felt like a question, or maybe a reassurance. Evan exhaled shakily. "Just slipped, that's all." The horse didn't move. His dark eyes remained locked on Evan with a focus that bordered on human. There was no impatience, no irritation, only vigilance, a quiet kind of concern that didn't need words. For a long moment they stayed like that, man on the ground, horse leaning close, breath mingling in the cold barn air. Something shifted in that stillness, not dramatically, not the kind of shift people write songs about. It was smaller than that. A softness, a loosening, a fragile bridge forming between two souls who had been carrying more weight than they knew how to voice. Finally, Evan pushed himself to sit, wincing at the sting in his ribs. Atlas lifted his head, but didn't step back. He stayed near the gate, ears tilted forward, as though unwilling to leave until Evan was fully upright. "Guess we both have some things to work through," Evan said, brushing straw from his coat. Atlas blinked once. It looked like agreement. The rest of the morning felt different, not easier, but less lonely. When Evan carried out the hay again, Atlas didn't tense as sharply when he stepped close. When Evan reached over the gate to adjust the water bucket, the horse stayed still instead of shifting away. These were small things, tiny, almost unnoticeable things. But they mattered more than the loud victories people chased in the world outside. They mattered because trust, real trust, never arrived as a thunderclap. It arrived on mornings like this, hidden inside moments quiet enough to miss. By midday, the mist had lifted, revealing a sky washed in a muted winter blue. Evan stepped outside to sweep the thin snow from the porch. His ribs still ached, but the memory of Atlas's gentle touch kept echoing through him like a warmth he didn't expect. He glanced toward the barn, where the open window above the stall let in a thin slice of light. Within that light, he could see the faint shape of the horse moving inside, slow and deliberate, as though settling into a place he hadn't yet decided whether to trust. "Thank you," Evan whispered under his breath, unsure if the wind carried the words anywhere at all. But back in the barn, Atlas lifted his head, just once, ears tilting, as though something familiar had brushed against him. Evening arrived quietly. When Evan returned to check on him, Atlas walked toward the gate rather than away from it. Not close enough to crowd him, just close enough to acknowledge him. Two souls that winter had bruised in different ways. Two lives that had not chosen each other, but had ended up under the same roof. And somehow, in one small fall on a cold barn floor, something had begun to mend. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost foreign in its steadiness. Winter still clung stubbornly to the land, but the harsh bite of January had softened into something more manageable. The mornings arrived a shade earlier, the light a touch warmer, as though the sun was finally remembering its promise to return. Evan stepped out each day with a little less heaviness in his stride, the memory of Atlas's gentle nudge lingering in the back of his mind like a hand placed lightly on his shoulder. He discovered something in those days. Trust didn't bloom. It accumulated in small, patient pieces. The first morning after the fall, Evan decided not to hurry anything. Rushing was what people did when they were afraid of falling behind, and he'd already learned how easily a desperate gesture could unravel progress. Instead, he approached Atlas slowly, speaking in a low, steady tone. The horse's ears turned toward him, not pinned back as before. A cautious curiosity replaced the rigid tension Evan had grown used to seeing. He clipped the lead rope gently, leaving enough slack for Atlas to feel unrestrained. The draft horse shifted his weight, testing the distance, the give in the rope, the intention in Evan's touch. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about the horse had the ease Rusty once carried, but it was honest. "Let's start simple today," Evan murmured. He led Atlas out of the stall and into the barnyard, where patches of bare earth peeked through the snow like forgotten islands. The air was sharp, but the sunlight lent a thin warmth that reached the skin if you stood still long enough. Evan walked slowly, letting Atlas match his pace. The horse's hooves left deep prints behind them, prints that looked like anchors securing him to the earth. They walked the perimeter of the yard first, then the length of the driveway, then the small path leading toward the pond, still frozen under layers of winter. Each step was deliberate, each pause intentional. When they returned to the barnyard, Evan halted and faced Atlas carefully. "Let's try something new." It wasn't much, just a basic step-back cue, something every working horse knew from habit, from repetition. But Atlas didn't react immediately. His ears twitched, his body tensed, not in resistance, but in uncertainty. Evan repeated the cue, softer this time, and lifted his hand in a clearer signal. Atlas shifted one hoof, just one, a hesitant backward step, but it was enough to make something warm move through Evan's chest. "Good," he whispered, offering a small piece of carrot from his pocket. Atlas didn't lunge for it. He didn't jerk away. He lowered his head just slightly, lips brushing Evan's palm in a careful, almost polite gesture. That single step back turned into 2 by afternoon, into 3 the next day. And soon other small victories followed. Atlas learned to yield his shoulder with the gentlest touch, to stand while Evan lifted each hoof to check the shoes, to follow a light lead rather than a firm pull. The progress wasn't linear. There were moments when Atlas froze again, when something invisible from his past surfaced and cast a shadow across his eyes. But each time, Evan simply paused, breathed, and started over. There was no room for frustration, not here, not with a horse whose silence told him more than any buck or kick ever could. One afternoon, as Evan tightened a new piece of leather onto the training harness, Hank Dawson appeared at the barn door. The older man leaned against the frame, thumbs hooked into the pockets of his shearling jacket. "Well now," Hank said, his voice warm and amused. "Looks like you've been busy." Evan chuckled softly. "Trying to. He's different." Hank eyed the gray horse, who watched him with steady, unreadable eyes. "Different ain't bad. Some animals are loud about their troubles. Others, well, they keep it under the hide. Those ones take longer." Evan nodded, tightening the strap carefully. "He listens. Not always the way I expect, but he listens." "That's all a man can ask," Hank replied. "Most creatures don't even give you that much." Atlas turned his head slightly, as though acknowledging the conversation. Hank laughed and shook his head. "Big fella's got a mind behind those eyes. Just give him space to show it." When Hank left, the barnyard returned to its steady quiet, the kind that always seemed to settle deeper after a visitor departed. Evan stepped back, studying Atlas as the horse flicked his tail lazily. The winter light hit the gray coat in soft glints, revealing variations in color, silver where the sun touched, charcoal in the shadows, a hint of blue along the ridge of his back. He hadn't expected this horse, this risky one, to be so deliberate in everything he did. Later that week, Evan decided to hitch Atlas to the empty cart for the first time. Not to pull anything heavy, just to let him feel the weight of the shafts, the rhythm of movement. He took his time adjusting the straps, checking the buckles twice to avoid any sudden discomfort that might trigger old memories. Atlas stood, patiently, legs square, ears relaxed. The trust wasn't perfect, but it was present, visible in the way he didn't flinch when Evan circled behind him, in the way he waited for the next cue instead of anticipating it with fear. When Evan climbed into the cart and gave a soft cluck, Atlas stepped forward with a slow, deliberate gait. The cart rolled gently behind them, its wheels whispering over the packed snow. Evan kept his hands loose, giving Atlas space to choose calmness. They circled the barn, then traced the outline of the fields, still dormant under winter's hold. With each turn, Atlas's confidence grew, not in himself, but in the quiet presence guiding him. The sky turned a soft lavender as dusk arrived. Evan halted the cart and exhaled deeply, wiping a bit of frost from his beard. "Good work today," he said, his voice carrying a warm finality. Atlas let out a slow breath, a cloud rising in the fading light. There were no grand achievements that day, no dramatic breakthroughs, just small lessons stacking upon each other, firm and slow. And for a man like Evan and a horse like Atlas, those lessons were the quiet kind that saved you, long before you realized you needed saving. By early March, winter loosened its grip on Montana, the way an old hand loosens from a shovel it has held too long. Not suddenly, not gently, just enough for a man to realize the world was thawing beneath his feet. Each morning, the ground gave off a darker smell, the scent of soil waking under the cold, remembering it had a job to do. The snow still clung to the shaded slopes, but along the open field, behind the barn, strips of bare earth appeared like faded brown scars tracing the land's bones. Evan noticed it first in the hoof prints Atlas left behind. A month ago, they had pressed into ice, crisp and unmistakable. Now, when Atlas walked across the field, the prints filled slowly with meltwater, edges softening before Evan could look twice. It reminded him that winter was not immortal, no matter how long it stayed. Work, however, was. And now that the land was waking, so were the tasks he had put off for too long. One morning, he led Atlas onto the open field to begin clearing the debris winter storms had left behind, fallen branches, dead weeds, fence posts that had split in the cold. Atlas walked beside him without the stiff tension of those first days, his breath forming soft clouds that drifted sideways in the breeze. Their footsteps made a wet, rhythmic sound in the thawing ground. "Let's see what damage we're dealing with," Evan said, mostly to himself. Atlas flicked an ear. They moved slowly across the field. The wind carried the scent of melting snow mixed with the faint trace of sagebrush from further out on the hills. Above them, the sky carried a shade of blue that only happened in early spring, washed out, delicate, as if still remembering winter's darkness. Evan bent to pick up a broken limb lodged beneath the fence line. It was heavier than he expected, soaked through from snowmelt. He hissed at the strain in his shoulder. Behind him, Atlas shifted, lowering his head as if curious. Evan smiled faintly. "All right," he said. "You win. You get the big ones." He fetched the light training harness they had practiced with and fastened it carefully across Atlas's chest. The horse didn't tense the way he once had. His muscles moved with a familiar acceptance, the kind earned through the quiet repetition of their weeks together. They started small. Evan attached a rope to a half-rotten stump no larger than a barrel, murmuring a cue they had rehearsed. Atlas leaned forward with that slow, deliberate power deep bred into horses of his kind. The stump rolled free with almost no resistance, the rope slackening as Atlas stepped forward. "Good," Evan said softly. They moved on to larger tasks. A long section of broken fence had collapsed beneath winter winds. The post was lodged under tangled wire, half buried in thawing mud. Evan tested it. Too heavy to lift, too awkward to drag alone. He tied the rope securely, gave Atlas the cue, and stepped aside. The draft horse dug his hooves into the damp ground and pulled. Not violently, not straining, just with a steady, certain force that belonged to creatures made to move the world inch by inch. The post slid free with a pop, and Atlas halted on his own, waiting for the next signal. Evan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're something else," he said under his breath. Atlas blinked, unimpressed by praise. By midday, the field had begun to take shape again. The old debris was cleared and piled neatly near the barn. The fence line was marked for repairs. The ground felt more like earth than ice. Evan wiped his forehead with the edge of his sleeve, the pale sun warming his face just enough to make him feel human again. These weren't grand accomplishments. No one would write about a man clearing his field. But they were the kinds of tasks that measured a life, not by achievement, but by steadiness, by showing up, by doing what could be done. He often paused to admire the way Atlas moved, not with the rigid defensiveness he once had, but with a controlled intention. The horse stayed near, but not too near. When Evan set down a tool, Atlas waited. When Evan walked ahead, Atlas followed at a distance that felt like respect rather than skittishness. It was a quiet companionship, not loud enough for neighbors to notice, but loud enough for a man who had lived alone too long. In the afternoon, Hank drove by in his dusty truck. He leaned an elbow out the open window, watching Atlas drag a larger section of broken fencing with a grace that belied his massive frame. "Well, I'll be damned," Hank said with a laugh. "Thought that horse was supposed to be a handful." Evan shrugged, though pride softened his features. "He listens when you speak his language." "Maybe you're the one learning his language." Hank tipped 2 fingers to his hat brim. "Either way, you got yourself a good worker there." When the truck rolled away, Evan rested a hand on the harness strap near Atlas's shoulder. The horse didn't stiffen, didn't pull away. He simply shifted his weight slightly, acknowledging the touch in a quiet, lifelong creature's way. As the sun lowered, painting the field gold, they made their way back to the barn. Atlas walked ahead now, confident in the path, stopping at the familiar stall without being guided. When Evan loosened the harness, the horse let out a long breath, neither tired nor strained, just content. Evan brushed Atlas's coat with slow, deliberate strokes. The fading light shot in the horse's gray speckled mane, turning it into something like silver. With each stroke, Evan felt the weight of winter slipping off both their backs. "Our first spring," he murmured. "Didn't think we'd make it this far." Atlas lowered his head, eyes half closed, breathing deep and steady. The barn fell into one of those silences that carried its own heartbeat. A silence that said nothing was perfect, nothing was certain, but something was growing here, something fragile, something patient. When Evan stepped outside, he looked back through the open barn door. Atlas stood in the center of his stall, quiet as dusk itself. The land was waking. The work was returning. And for the first time in months, Evan felt ready. He closed the barn door gently, the hinges humming their familiar song, and walked toward the house with a steadiness he hadn't felt since before the snow began. The storm didn't announce itself with thunder or wind. It arrived the way trouble often does in Montana, quietly, slipping in under a sky that had been perfectly ordinary just hours before. By late afternoon, a gray veil thickened over the mountains, spreading like ink through water. Evan noticed it first while stacking the last of the fence rails near the barn. The air felt softer, almost warm, the way it sometimes did before a heavy weather shift. Atlas raised his head toward the ridge, ears sharpening to a point. "You feel that too?" Evan asked, though the horse needed no explanation. By dusk, the first drops fell, slow, heavy, spaced apart like footsteps approaching from a distance. Evan hurried to close the barn windows before the wind picked up. The smell of rain mixed with thawing earth seeped into every corner of the farm. Spring storms were common, but something about this one carried an unease that settled deep inside his ribs. The northern hill, an old slab of soil and rock rising behind the pasture, had taken winter harder than usual. He'd seen cracks forming along its side for weeks, tiny ones at first, thin as a pencil mark. But recently they had widened, collecting meltwater that had nowhere to drain. The land was softening from the inside, like bread left too long in a bucket of water. As the rain intensified, Evan checked on the cattle in the lower lot. They clustered near the shelter, restless but not panicked. A good sign. He was halfway across the yard when a sudden shift in the wind sent a cold rush of air down the slope. The rain quickened. A shiver crawled up his spine. Another hour passed before the real sound came, the low, grinding groan of something heavy, deciding it no longer wanted to stay where it was. It came from the northern hill, faint at first, then unmistakable. Evan froze. Then he ran. The rain slicked the ground, turning mud into something that clung to his boots with each stride. His flashlight wavered in his hand, beam jumping with every impact of his feet. When he reached the base of the hill, the breath left his chest. A long, jagged crack split across the slope like a fresh wound. Mud swelled at its edges, pushing outward. Water poured through it, carving channels as it rushed downward. "Not tonight," Evan whispered. "Please, not tonight." Another groan rolled through the earth, deeper this time, like the distant sound of a tree splitting in winter freeze. Then the ground shifted. A whole section of the hillside slumped forward, dragging soil, rocks, and broken roots with it. The mudslide moved slowly at first, as though testing its own momentum, then picked up speed. It was heading directly toward the cattle shelter. Evan spun around and sprinted toward the barn. "Atlas!" he shouted as he burst through the doors. The horse was already alert, nostrils flared, muscles tight beneath his gray coat. The reins hung on the wall, still damp from earlier work. Evan grabbed them with hands shaking from adrenaline. He didn't have time to think. Not about danger, not about risk, not about whether this was wise. The cattle couldn't outrun that slope, but Atlas could pull them out. He threw open the stall gate. "Come on, boy, I need you." Atlas stepped forward without hesitation. Rain hammered against the barn roof, drowning every sound but their breathing. Evan fastened the chest harness with trembling fingers, checking each buckle with the speed of a man whose life depended on getting it right the first time. When he swung the barn doors open, wind shoved its way inside, flinging droplets into their faces. Atlas stepped into the storm like a creature built for it. Together they raced toward the lower lot. The mudslide had slowed but grown larger. An ugly tide of dark earth inching closer to the wooden shelter. The cattle bellowed, panicked, hooves slipping in the wet ground. Evan didn't shout commands. He didn't need to. Atlas moved as if he already understood. They reached the first trapped cow, a heifer whose hind legs were sinking into the mud near the broken fence line. Evan tied the rope around her chest, hands numb from the rain. He gave Atlas the signal, but the draft horse was already leaning into the harness, pulling with measured, anchored strength. The heifer came free with a grunt, stumbling to safety. "Good boy," Evan yelled over the roar of rain. They moved to the next one, then another. Each rescue grew harder as the mud thickened, clinging like tar. The rain blurred everything, his vision, the ground, the sky. Atlas's coat was soaked through, mane plastered against his neck, but his eyes stayed sharp, fixed on Evan's gestures. His hooves dug deep with each pull, finding balance on unstable ground as if guided by instinct older than memory. A sudden crack thundered across the hillside. A large slab of earth broke loose near the top. "Move!" Evan shouted. Atlas jerked sideways, narrowly avoiding the falling debris. Mud splashed over them both. Evan lost his footing, skidding on his knees. Atlas turned sharply, stepping toward him with a low, urgent sound rumbling from his chest. The horse lowered his head, nudging Evan upright. "I'm fine," Evan gasped. "Let's keep going." They reached the last of the trapped cattle, a young steer pinned against a collapsed fence post. The mud swallowed its legs deeper each second. Evan tied the rope, fingers slipping. Atlas backed up on cue, straining against the dead weight. His muscles trembled, his hooves sinking, but he didn't stop. "Come on," Evan breathed. "Just one more." Atlas leaned into the pull with everything he had. The steer came free. At the top of the hill, the final section of loosened earth gave way. Evan heard the rumble before he saw it, a terrible, rolling growl that vibrated through his bones. He turned to look up. Too late to run. Atlas saw it first. The horse lunged sideways, swinging his body between Evan and the oncoming wave of mud. The edge of the slide slammed into Atlas's flank, splattering across his legs but missing Evan entirely. The horse braced himself, hooves sliding but holding. The earth finally settled. The worst of the movement stopped. The cattle huddled away from the danger, trembling but alive. Evan, chest heaving, pressed a hand to Atlas's muddy shoulder. The horse's sides rose and fell with exhaustion, but his eyes were steady, bright even in the darkness. A soft sound left Evan's throat, something between relief and awe. "You saved them," he whispered. "You saved all of them." Atlas exhaled, long and warm in the cold night. For the first time, Evan felt no distance between them, no unspoken hesitation, no shadow of the past, just two living souls standing in the rain, bound by a night that had asked more of them than they thought they had to give. A night the mountain moved and the horse didn't. The storm passed some time before dawn, slipping away like a thief satisfied with what it had taken. By the time the first weak strands of sunlight reached across the valley, the land was quiet again. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a night where the earth itself had shifted. Evan stepped out of the house with boots still wet from last night's mud, and every muscle in his body protested. But the silence tugged at him, urging him to make sure the stillness wasn't hiding something he wasn't ready to lose. The air smelled of soaked timber and churned soil. Thin wisps of fog rose from the pasture, drifting like ghosts searching for where they belonged. The cattle were clustered near the far fence line, tired but upright, their sides rising in steady rhythms. Relief washed through him, slow and heavy. They were alive, because Atlas had stood between them and disaster when no other force on the farm could. He found the horse near the slope's edge, where last night's mudslide had carved a fresh scar into the hillside. Atlas stood still, almost statuesque, as if contemplating the wound nature had opened in the land. His gray coat was caked with dried mud up to his flanks, streaking him in browns and blacks that made him look older, harder, like a creature pulled from ancient stone. "Morning," Evan said softly. Atlas didn't turn immediately. When he did, it was slow, as though he had only now come back into his own body. The horse's eyes, usually so deep and watchful, held something quieter today. Fatigue, certainly, but also a certain calm earned only by those who had faced down something bigger than themselves and survived. Evan approached, hand hovering first, then settling gently on Atlas's neck. The warmth beneath the mud was reassuring. The horse shifted his weight slightly, inviting the contact without stepping away. The trust between them, once fragile as thawing ice, felt rooted now, solid, shaped by a night no one else would ever fully understand. "You did more than I ever had the right to ask," Evan murmured, fingers brushing the edge of a dried cut along Atlas's flank. "Now let's see how much of you the hill tried to take." He led Atlas toward the barn. The horse followed, steps steady despite the long night. Inside, the smell of hay and wood struck a comforting contrast to the sharp scent of wet soil outside. Light filtered in through the windows, catching on the drifting dust. Evan tied Atlas loosely in the center bay, enough freedom to shift, enough security for him to work without worry. One bucket of warm water, one brush, one quiet hour. That was all he planned. As he dipped the cloth and began wiping away the mud, Atlas stood almost perfectly still. The storm had left streaks along his ribs and legs, each one telling a different chapter of the night, where he'd braced himself against the slide, where debris had clawed at his skin, where he had planted his weight to save the last steer. Evan worked slowly, careful not to startle Atlas with cold touches. "You know," he said quietly, not expecting an answer, "Rusty used to lean into the brush like it was his favorite thing. You just accept it, like everything else." Atlas's ears twitched at the name Rusty, as if he understood the reverence behind it. While he worked, footsteps sounded at the barn. Door. Marlene Carter appeared, her coat still damp from the morning fog. She carried her vet bag slung over one shoulder and wore an expression halfway between concern and curiosity. "I heard the hill gave way last night," she said. "You all right?" "We're all still standing," Evan replied, "mostly thanks to him." Her gaze landed on Atlas, and her eyebrows lifted. "He looks better than I expected, for a horse that took a chunk of the mountain to the side anyway." Evan stepped aside to give her space. Marlene approached with slow confidence, letting Atlas sniff her hand before she touched him. She went through her practiced routine, checking his pupils, running her fingers down his legs, pressing lightly along the muscles that had carried so much weight in the dark. "He's strong," she said, almost to herself. "I know." Evan paused. "But not just strong." Marlene nodded. She stepped back, arms crossed thoughtfully, eyes tracing the lines of Atlas's frame. "Do you remember when I told you he wasn't just any draft horse? When we first looked at him?" "Yeah," Evan said. "Something about his build?" "Build, temperament, the way he interprets cues." She drew a slow breath. "I did some digging after that. Atlas. He's not from your everyday working line. He's what we call a northern heavy, rare, old stock. Horses bred generations back for tough terrain, long hauls, unpredictable environments. They weren't trained to be fancy. They were trained to think, to adapt, to protect their handler when things turned ugly." Evan blinked at her. "You're saying he's special?" "I'm saying he's bred for exactly what he did last night. Most horses would have panicked, lost their footing, maybe even bolted." Marlene's voice softened. "But he didn't, because something in him knows how to read the land, how to brace, how to choose the safest path when everything is collapsing around him." Evan turned to Atlas, the truth settling into his chest like a warm stone. "So that's why he moved before I did." Marlene smiled. "Horses like him? They don't wait for permission. They react to keep their handler alive." The words sank deep. Alive. Evan looked at Atlas again, really looked. The scars, the wary eyes that had slowly softened. The power that chose restraint instead of chaos. The patience that had allowed him to relearn trust 1 inch at a time. "Someone didn't understand him," Marlene added quietly. "Maybe pushed him too hard, or punished him for reacting the way he was bred to. A horse like this, he needs someone who listens. Evan felt the weight of that, heavier than the storm, heavier than the mountain. "I'm trying," he whispered. Atlas, as if hearing something more than sound, shifted closer and lowered his head until it rested lightly against Evan's shoulder, a gesture so deliberate, so filled with quiet acceptance, that Evan closed his eyes. Against the sudden sting behind them, Marlene stepped back toward the door. "Keep doing what you're doing. He chose to trust you. That's not something these horses give lightly." When she left, the barn settled into its familiar silence, the kind that didn't feel empty, but full, alive, warm. Evan finished brushing the last of the mud from Atlas's coat. The horse's gray shone faintly in the morning light, a color pulled fresh from the storm itself. "You're not what people said you were," Evan murmured. Atlas breathed out softly, calm and steady. "And I'm not who I was when you arrived." The horse flicked his ear, listening. The hill had fallen. The storm had challenged everything. But something stronger had risen from it, something built quietly, patiently, between man and horse. And now Evan understood. A horse like Atlas didn't just save a farm. He reshaped the man who needed saving more than he ever admitted. The morning after Marlene's visit felt different, not because the storm had passed, but because what she'd said lingered in the air like smoke that hadn't yet cleared. Evan stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands, steam curling upward into the cold spring light. The world was still in recovery. The land wore fresh wounds. The cattle moved slower. The fences sagged where the mudslide had brushed them aside. Everything needed fixing, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel alone at the edge of that long list. His eyes drifted toward the barn. Atlas stood just outside it, framed by the pale sun, the mud on his coat now dry and cracking like old paint. He was grazing in slow, mindful bites, choosing tufts of brown grass that had survived the winter. Each movement seemed purposeful, not cautious, not fearful, but deliberate, like a creature who had finally found a place where he didn't have to second-guess every breath. Evan walked toward him, taking slow steps, letting the crunch of thawing ground announce his presence. Atlas lifted his head, ears forward in that way he'd begun reserving only for Evan. Not many others had seen that softness yet. "You sleep any?" Evan asked, voice low. Atlas blinked slowly, as if amused by the question. Evan reached out and brushed a flake of dried mud from Atlas's cheek. "You know, I keep thinking about what she said, about you being one of those northern heavies." The term still sounded strange on his tongue, heavy. But to work with Atlas was to understand the weight in his silence, the intelligence behind those eyes. "Doesn't change who you are to me," he added, "but it explains a hell of a lot." A gust of wind rolled down the hill, carrying the scent of wet soil. Evan looked toward the scar where the earth had torn itself apart. The ridge was quieter now, but he could feel its instability like a memory that refused to fade. Last night could have ended differently. Easily, terribly differently. The image of Atlas throwing his body between him and the falling mud still replayed in his mind, sharper than any nightmare. He didn't want to think about that. Not yet. Instead, he focused on the horse before him, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the calm strength that seemed impossible after such a night. "You saved my life," Evan said, the words heavier than he expected. "Not just the cattle, not just the farm. Me." Atlas lowered his head, pressing his forehead lightly against Evan's chest. A gesture that, with any other horse, might have felt like coincidence. But not with him. Not this horse who moved with intention, who read the world with ancient instinct, who seemed to act from a place deeper than simple training. Evan rested his hand on Atlas's neck. "I don't know who let you down before, but you're home now." The wind shifted again, and behind them the gravel crackled under approaching boots. Hank Dawson appeared, his hat pulled low against the cold. "You two look like you've been through a war," he called, though his voice carried a warmth that softened the words. "Feels like it," Evan replied. Hank stopped beside them, studying Atlas with an expression that bordered on respect. "Heard about what happened from Marlene. Word gets around fast when a fella outruns half a mountain." Evan shook his head. "It wasn't me." Hank's gaze lingered on the dried mud along Atlas's flank. "Looks like he took the worst of it." "He did," Evan said quietly. Hank whistled low under his breath. "Most horses would have run the second the earth started groaning. Hell, most people would have run. He didn't run." "No," Hank agreed. "He planted himself." A moment passed, filled only by the gentle pull of wind through the grass. Then the older man looked toward the ridge, squinting. "You're gonna need help fixing that. Hill won't hold next rain." "I know," Evan said, and for once the knowledge didn't feel like a weight he was carrying alone. Hank tipped his hat. "I'll bring my tools by tomorrow." When the rancher's truck finally rolled away, Evan turned back to Atlas. The horse had settled into a quiet stillness again, watching the ridge as if contemplating the land's next move. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were alert, always assessing, always aware. Evan walked around to his side, brushing away more dried soil. Beneath the mud, a faint line of older scars glimmered, scars he hadn't noticed before, now visible in the morning light. Some healed long ago, others more recent, marks that told a story of a life lived on uneven ground. "What did they ask of you, boy?" Evan whispered. "And what did you have to carry alone?" Atlas didn't shift, didn't flinch. He simply breathed, slow and calm. Evan felt something tighten inside him. Not fear, not grief, but recognition. He knew what it was to carry more than you were meant to be misunderstood, mishandled, pushed harder than your breaking point, to survive because you had no other choice. It had taken both of them a long, lonely road to get here. He walked around to face Atlas directly. "I think Marlene's right," he said softly. "You needed someone who listens." Atlas's breath touched his hands, warm in the cold air. "But here's the thing," Evan added, "so did I." The moment held, quiet, still, a pause in a story that had been rushing forward for too long. He didn't reach for reins or rope. He didn't ask anything of the horse. He simply stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, looking out over a farm that was still battered but alive. And for the first time since his wife died, Evan felt something he didn't recognize at first because it had been so long. He felt steady, not healed, not whole, just steady. And that was more than enough to begin again. Above them the sun climbed slowly, catching the edges of Atlas's gray coat until the horse glowed faintly, like embers revived after a long night. Whatever came next, fences to mend, slopes to shore up, debts to face, they would face it together. Not as man and burden, but as equals who had chosen one another. Spring settled over the Miller farm slowly, as if afraid to disturb what winter had nearly taken. The air warmed in cautious degrees, the soil softened, and small shoots of green began to appear along the fence line, quiet, stubborn survivors pushing through the thaw. Evan found himself waking earlier these days, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Something about the morning light felt different now, less like a reminder of what needed doing and more like an invitation. Atlas stood in the pasture most mornings, watching the sun rise with the stillness of an old sentinel. His coat, now fully brushed free of the storm's residue, gleamed in shades of silver and steel. Every so often, when the wind lifted, Evan could see the faint scars beneath the hair, marks of a life that hadn't been gentle but had shaped him into the creature standing before him. One day, as Evan replaced the last of the broken fence rails, Marlene drove up the gravel path. The cattle lifted their heads as her truck passed, but remained unbothered. She stepped out, the sun catching in her hair as she waved. "You've been busy," she said. "Had to keep the hill from taking another bite," Evan replied, hammering a final nail. She walked over, examining the repaired fence. "Looks solid." "Hope so. I don't think the land has another slide left in it. Not this season, anyway." Her gaze drifted toward Atlas grazing nearby. He looked settled, more settled than I've ever seen him. Evan leaned on the fence, watching the horse tug at a patch of new grass with methodical patience. "He's different," he said. "Still quiet, but not like he's waiting for something bad to happen anymore." "That's because he's not alone," Marlene said simply. Evan didn't respond right away. Not because he disagreed, but because her words hit deeper than she knew. For months he had lived inside a silence that felt too big, too empty. He had moved through his days as though carrying the weight of someone missing, someone whose absence left a space he didn't know how to fill. Atlas hadn't filled that space, but he'd taught Evan how to stand in it without collapsing. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail, the kind with a government return address that usually meant bad news. Evan hesitated before opening it, the envelope heavy with possibility. But this one wasn't a warning or a notice. It was an invitation. A regional agriculture board had heard about the mudslide rescue. Apparently Hank had talked, and those things traveled quickly through small towns. They wanted Evan to bring Atlas to a spring showcase in Bozeman. They were highlighting breeds capable of supporting farms transitioning away from heavy machinery. Sustainability, the letter said. Resilient livestock for resilient communities. Evan folded the letter slowly. Atlas wasn't a show horse. He wasn't a spectacle. But he was something rare, something quietly extraordinary. That evening he walked to the pasture where the horse grazed in long, patient strokes. "Got something to ask you," he murmured as he held out the letter. "You think we should go?" Atlas brushed his muzzle against Evan's sleeve, not to answer, but to acknowledge the question. And the man. "Yeah," Evan said softly. "That's what I thought." They spent the next days preparing, not for a competition, but for a journey neither of them had imagined, back when Atlas arrived frightened and worn, and Evan greeted each sunrise with exhaustion instead of hope. The preparations were simple: checking the trailer, brushing Atlas's coat until it shone like river stone, walking the paths around the property so their steps were in sync. On the morning of the showcase, the farm smelled of thawing earth and spring wind. Evan led Atlas to the trailer. For a moment the horse paused, not in fear, but in memory. Trailers had not always been kind to him, but after one long breath, Atlas stepped forward willingly, trusting that this man would not lead him into darkness without light at the other end. The road to Bozeman wound through open plains and rising foothills. Evan drove with one eye on the mirror, watching Atlas's calm silhouette shift gently with the movement of the trailer. It struck him that the horse wasn't just steady now. He was at peace. At the showcase, farmers, ranchers, and breeders walked among the pens and corrals. Horses of every size and color flicked their tails in the spring air. When Evan led Atlas into the central ring, conversations quieted. Not in awe. These were people who had seen thousands of horses, but in respect. There was something about Atlas's presence that demanded silence before understanding. A judge approached, gray-bearded and sharp-eyed. "What's his line?" he asked. "Northern Heavy," Evan said. The judge paused, studying Atlas with new intensity. "Didn't think I'd see one of these again in my lifetime." Atlas stood calmly beside Evan, ears relaxed, eyes soft. Not showing off, not performing, just being. The judge nodded slowly. Not many horses left that carry themselves like that. You take care of him? Evan looked at Atlas, at the strength beneath the scars, at the quiet in his eyes that was no longer fear. He takes care of me, Evan said. That answer seemed to be enough. The man smiled and moved on. The event wasn't about ribbons or trophies, it was about connection, humans and animals working toward a future that didn't forget where they came from. And in that shared space, Evan felt something uncoil inside him. Not pride exactly, something softer, gratitude maybe, or belonging. When they returned home later that day, the sun was sinking behind the ridge. Atlas stepped out of the trailer and inhaled deeply, ears flicking at the familiar sounds of his pasture. Evan walked beside him, feeling the quiet hum of the land settling into evening. He rested his hand on Atlas's neck, fingers brushing the spot where the storm's mud had once clung. "We made it," he whispered. And the horse, with the patience of something ancient and kind, lowered his head until it rested against Evan's shoulder, just as he had on the morning after the storm. They stood that way for a long time, shadows stretching across the field, the world around them breathing in and out in slow, steady rhythm. Not a beginning, not an ending, just a point in time where two lives that had once traveled separately now moved forward together, quietly, deliberately, without fear. And beneath the rising stars of a Montana night, Evan understood. What remains after the quiet is not what was lost. It is what stayed, what chose to stay, what learned to trust again. Atlas lifted his head, eyes reflecting the last glint of daylight. Evan smiled. "Let's go home," he said. And side by side, they walked toward the barn. If this story touched something quiet inside you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments what part stayed with you the most. And if you'd like to join me for more stories of people and the animals who changed their lives, consider subscribing. I'll be here sharing the next chapter when you're ready.